You go and have a seat. You know, the truth is, I come into this week with a pretty heavy spirit, just lots of stuff swirling around in our world as a community, in my own world privately. There's a heaviness, a weight. One of the things that bears heavy on my spirit these days is this continual discourse of othering that just continues to press in, that our identity is somehow found in differentiating ourselves, that our identity as humans, our identity as Americans, our identity as immigrants, our identity as queer people, our identity as parents, whatever it is, there's something called a discourse of othering, where differentiation is the mode in which we find and create our identity. It's been part of the Christian tradition since the church fathers established an identity of Christianity over and against what they would eventually label as heresy and the exclusion of people that didn't quite believe exactly as they believed. And then it carries into the Protestant Reformation, and it's just part of our tradition. We're really good at othering. And this discourse of othering, this differentiation that we participate in our society, it relies on the rhetoric of power, it relies on the rhetoric of fear, and it relies on the rhetoric of dehumanization. It relies on calling people and cultures garbage. It relies on hyperbole and exaggeration. And in any collective, when the dominant collective identity is threatened, what has become comfortable for the dominant group, when that identity gets threatened, when there's a shift that happens in a cultural collective, the tactic is to rally the troops through othering. The tactic is to present others not simply as outside or not simply as different, but as dangerous and nearly inhuman. And we can look through history and we can see some of the worst atrocities that have ever taken place, the worst genocides that have ever taken place. And at the heart of it is language of dehumanization and othering. Are you ready for this next statement? White Christian nationalism has a PhD in othering. It is a movement that has infiltrated and filtered into the Christian tradition, that is grounded in this idea, in racist ideas. It's grounded in ideas of elitism, exceptionalism. John Blake, who's an analyst who writes for a couple of different outlets, he said this. He said, "It's been called imposter Christianity, a heretical faith that sanctifies lies and the most serious threat to democracy in America." He says that's how critics have described white Christian nationalism. He says it's a deviant strain of religion that has infected the political mainstream. He says white Christian nationalists believe the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation, although the Constitution never mentions God and enshrines the separation of church and state. Its adherents twist biblical language to justify violence, sexism, and hostility towards people of color. Professor Philip Gorski, he's a professor at Yale, he's a scholar. He wrote a piece in 2021 titled "White Christian Nationalism, the Deep Story Behind the Capitol Insurrection." And he talks about how that day it looked like there was this kind of motley crew of protesters. And I'm quoting him, he says, you saw all these different people in the images that you saw. There was country club Republicans, well-dressed social conservatives, white evangelicals in Jesus caps, shoulder to shoulder with QAnon cultists, Second Amendment cosplay commandos, and hardcore other folks just in their Auschwitz hoodies. All collected in this space. And he says, it seems like, and it felt like it was this very weird assemblage, but he says, as you take a closer look, the murkier things would become. And he said, there were Christians there that were waving political flags, Trump flags, and there were Proud Boys that knelt and prayed that day. He said one man decked out as this cosplay crusader clutched a leather Bible to his chest with skeleton gloves. And what looked like apples and oranges, he writes, turned out to be a fruit cocktail that would become really known and that would spark and give a picture of what exactly white Christian nationalism is. So I think the reality is in the heart of many in our tradition, many in the Christian tradition, the difficult peacemaking path of Jesus, a brown-skinned Jewish peasant, undocumented immigrant, who did not have citizenship, who did not have any money, who did not have a political voice, who never wrote a book, who in all likelihood couldn't read, that this Jesus who condemned violence, that this Jesus who taught love of enemy, who welcomed the sinners, as they were called in his day by the elite, who was falsely accused and executed by the state, that Jesus has been rejected. That Jesus doesn't exist in so many of our circles because that Jesus has been replaced, and that peacemaking path has been replaced by the intoxicating path of American exceptionalism, partisan political power, and financial wealth. All those things, American exceptionalism, partisan political power, financial wealth, all of these things flourish and grow in a garden that is fertilized with fear of the other. It is the accelerant. And you say, well, how does that happen? Maybe some of you are sitting here going, well, why? Right? I mean, we don't have enough time. I'm trying not to take a lot of time today because we got a celebration and meeting, but how that happens, there's a couple of things that I think are really interesting, that are real basic, that has allowed this kind of transformation of Jesus and this othering to take place within this tradition that I have grown up in, that I think offers a beautiful way of engaging with the divine. But today I just want to focus on a couple of things that I think have promoted exclusion. I think white Christian nationalism, religion oftentimes in general, will mistake the idea of invitation for inclusion. By the way, you have no talk notes today because I've had one tough week. Let's put it that way. So sorry, you have a blank talk notes, so you can write down anything you find of interest and we can chat about it later. But I think what happens is in religion oftentimes, in communities of faith, certainly amongst white Christian nationalist rhetoric, we mistake invitation for inclusion. We think that because someone is invited, they're included. How many of you have ever been invited somewhere and sat there and felt like, whoa, I do not belong? Yeah. And it happens in churches all over our community, all over our nation, all over the world. The other thing that we do is we mistake, oftentimes in religion, certainly within white Christian nationalism, we'll mistake welcoming for inclusion. Like, because we walk into a space that we've been invited to, and because maybe that space feels like, oh, you haven't always been, but now you're welcomed into that space and you're treated with a measure of dignity, a measure of respect, up to a certain point, we think that's inclusion, but that's just welcoming. Now, invitation and welcome, it's courteous, I'll give you that. It's a measure of kindness, it's politeness, but it isn't inclusion. It's just not inclusion. See, a person isn't included simply because they're present in the room. And some of you who have been marginalized, who are sitting in this room, you're not even sure here if you're fully included. Because your life, you've embodied it, you've experienced it, your heart has raced at it. Like you know it more than anyone. That just being present or welcomed into a space does not mean that you have been included. Because here's the thing, inclusion is what I will call divine amplification. See, inclusion is not invitation. Inclusion is not welcome. Inclusion is the amplification of voices and experiences and wisdom and bodies of marginalized people. It is the amplification of it. It's not simply the presence of it. It is taking that voice, that body, that experience, that wisdom, that way of seeing that has been suppressed, that has been decentered, that has been pushed to the margins, and is saying, whoa, we're gonna back off some stuff and we're gonna bring it in and we're going to elevate that. And we're going to give it a space of honor because it's been so pushed and it's been so silenced. That's inclusion. That's the Jesus way of responding to otherness. It's not to say, well, I've saved a seat at the table for you. It's to say, no, we've saved 18 seats at the table for you, and we want to hear, and we want to be led by you, and we want to understand you. And that's what Jesus did. Like Jesus, how did he respond to those who othered in his culture? Here's the thing. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of things, and I'm going to give you some passages that you can look up on your own, but today I'm not going to read through them one by one, okay? We're not going to go verse by verse today. If you're here today and you're like, he didn't read a Bible verse today, you are correct. I didn't. It will be here next week, I promise. But I want to show you it's just there. What did Jesus do with the others of his day? Well, some of the others of his day were what were called tax collectors and sinners and Samaritans. They were categories of people that didn't meet the standards of the religious leaders of the day. They didn't meet the standards of the economy of the day. They didn't meet the standards of the culture of the day. And so we have a beautiful story. Jesus encounters a man named Zacchaeus, who's a tax collector, who can't see, and he climbs up into a tree. And Jesus chose to identify and elevate Zacchaeus. He pointed him out and he said, out of all the people here, Zacchaeus, I have to have dinner with you at your house. We're talking about one of the most socially unacceptable things you could ever do as a Jew was to go have dinner with a tax collector. And Jesus didn't do it quietly. He shouted it out. Zacchaeus, get down from the tree. I'm going to give you the best view possible because I want to have the best view possible, because blessed are those who hunger and thirst for me. So we're going to go share a meal together. We're going to go share a meal together. And that's what Jesus did with the one who was othered, who people were probably glad Zacchaeus was up in the tree. That's where you belong, Zacchaeus, up in the tree. Women and Samaritans were marginalized. Some woman was like, yes. Come on. What did Jesus do? How did he respond? Well, we have this beautiful story in John of the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus encounters, and he goes right up to her and he speaks to her and he gives her dignity and honor, and he says, I know all about your life. Yeah, I get it. But I'm going to entrust with you the truth of who I am, and I'm going to send you out as the first evangelist into your community, and you're going to go out and tell everybody about me. The despised Samaritan. The half-breed, the people who couldn't worship correctly. Jesus says, oh my gosh, listen, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you worship on that mountain. Doesn't matter if you worship in this mountain. Worship in your heart, spirit and truth. God will be found in that intimacy. God will be found in that intention. And our Christian tradition has missed that because we've been drunk on power and elitism and exceptionalism, that our way is the only way and you have to do it. And Jesus is like, go worship on that mountain. God's just too big. Absolutely, just worship in spirit and truth. You will encounter. It'll be revealed to you. He spoke with her with dignity. And the disciples were like, well, I wonder what Jesus is doing with her. He didn't care. He didn't care what anybody thought about his encounter, his embrace of, his elevation of the other. He treats her with dignity and grace and kindness. The sick were marginalized. Not that we do that today. Those with disabilities, those that find themselves with chronic illness, we don't marginalize them. We make life super easy for them in our world. If you're here today and you would identify with that and you would say, oh yeah, it's tough. Our world is disabling. Stairs are disabling, by the way. Right? I mean, it's just a different perspective, a different way of seeing the world. But what does Jesus do when he encounters the sick? We have this beautiful story of this blind man who was begging, and his name was Bartimaeus. And he was hollering on the side of the road, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And what was everybody around him doing? Shut it down. Shut it down, Bartimaeus. You're a sinner. You're receiving your reward. That was the silencing, was you deserve it. You've done something wrong. The dominant theology of the day said you're blind because of your sin or your parents' sin. You're impure. Jesus says, well, bring him here. Come on, bring him here. Come here. He says, well, what can I do for you? I imagine Bartimaeus was like, seriously, Jesus? This is not starting off, well, what do you think I want you to do for me? Like, let's have lunch. I'd like to see, is what he says. Jesus says, your faith has healed you. Go. There's a healing that takes place in this story, a bringing of Bartimaeus back into community. He doesn't just kind of say a whisper. No, he puts Bartimaeus in the center. He decenters power, decenters the voices that would silence Bartimaeus, and brings Bartimaeus' voice closer. He elevates it. That's how Jesus responded. The poor. Again, these are things that I know it's hard for us to relate to. We really don't exclude the poor. Like, we really don't think about economics when we vote anymore. These are, I know, you're going to have to really suspend some things to try and enter into this world of antiquity that's so very foreign, where poor people are marginalized. I hope you're picking up my extremely sarcastic. What does Jesus do with the poor? What does he do? Well, he says, look, there's this woman. And I don't know what happened to the back screen, by the way, but we just lost everything. He looks at, and if somebody wants to hand me my phone, Tim, that's in the back, it's in my backpack there, just in case we can't get my notes up, because I'll ramble on about this topic forever. Oh, I can look at it right here. Look at that. The poor widow's offering. What does Jesus do, right? He looks and sees this woman who comes and says, all I have are these 2 little pennies. And everybody's kind of looking at her, and she's probably embarrassed. And people are thinking, oh my gosh, what are they actually giving her this for? Why does it matter, But Jesus says, I tell you what, she has given more than anybody else because she gives out of her lack. She gives out of her lack. This is Jesus, who says, hey, those that have been othered, those that have been pushed to the margins, those that have been set outside, he says, nope, thank you, Casey. He says, nope, we're gonna showcase them. We're gonna make them models for what true devotion looks like. The Roman centurion, I mean, we could go on and on and on. The Roman centurion comes, he has a servant, and who's sick, and he's coming to Jesus, says, will you come? And I'm just sick, and I don't know what to do. And Jesus says, let's go. And the guy says, no, you don't need to go. I'm not worthy for you to come to my house. Just say the word. I have 100 under my care, and I speak and they move. You just say the word. And Jesus says what? To this Roman centurion, I'm telling you, nobody liked a Roman centurion in Jerusalem at this time. Not a popular gig. And Jesus looks at him and says, I've never seen faith like this in all of Israel. Not all of Israel. I'm telling you, this Roman centurion, we want to romanticize, he must have been like a convert to Judaism. Highly unlikely. He's just a Roman citizen that knows that Jesus has power. In all of Israel. You know who Jesus was talking? All of Israel is who Jesus was talking about. Right? I mean, basically Jesus said, this dude's faith like makes you all. See, Jesus amplified and included the voices and the stories that the dominant culture pushed to the margins. And the dominant culture arrested him, tortured him, and crucified him for threatening the identity politics of those in power. Now, if you can strip your mind of all of the beautiful meaning making that has taken place over the death of this first century Jewish peasant, all the meaning making, all the language that Paul throws in to make sense of tragedy, all the language, but if you just distill it down, what happened, historically speaking, that's what happened. The identity politics of power were threatened, and Jesus needed to be shut down. His vision for including the ones that power excluded, that power needed to be the other so that they could find their identity. See, if you're going to be pure, you have to have an impure. They can't exist outside of one another. These words don't make any sense if you don't have the other. Some of you are just like, I see it in your eyes. Like you cannot have purity without impurity. You cannot have orthodoxy without heresy. You need both to survive. See, these are identities that are formed through differentiation and through exclusion. And until we establish a Jesus view of things, right? Where Jesus is like, that mountain, this mountain, whatever. You give everything, you give little, whatever. Right? That mentality that says we're living in love and grace. We've been clouded with a lie. And that freedom to embrace everyone and to let those categories of purity and impurity and sacred and profane, which is very difficult because our whole world is based upon these things, but to try and live in a salvation above that. We're doomed. We're destined. And we will fall into it. No matter how hard you try. I mean, it's all throughout the pages of our texts, of our sacred texts. And it's not just, I know some of you are like, oh, that's Old Testament. In the New Testament, everything's perfect. Ha! Like, read the book of Titus. In this little letter called Titus, in chapter 1, there's the most racist thing about Cretans that the writer of Titus draws into. And he just calls they're like Cretans who are godless and immoral. And it's completely racist, and it's right there. Like, we're not off the hook because we follow Jesus. We're not off the hook because we read the Bible. We have the hard work of identifying the othering even within our tradition and saying, that's not Jesus. That's not the ultimate ideal, but it is a reflection of who we are, and we have a tendency to do that. So how do we live this as a church? How do we live this inclusion, this amplification? So here's the thing. I want to say right now that we as a church, as a community of people, have to commit to amplifying people who are marginalized by racist, sexist, and homophobic religious and political rhetoric and policies. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to do that. We have to elevate the voices. And so we have Proud Peacemakers, which is a safe space for the queer community to come and process trauma together. And please don't come to me and say, well, how come I don't have a group? How come I don't have, why is everything about that? And that's what happens. Because voices that have been oppressed and marginalized and erased have to be elevated. We have to elevate them so that we can be transformed by it. There is a salvation that only comes when we stare at that with which we have crucified. And that's the only way we're transformed. If we take things literally, we will never be transformed into love. But if we are willing to humble ourselves and kneel at the cross of the people and the places that we have crucified and continue to crucify, and we gaze and we look, we will find Christ and we will be transformed. And it's not popular right now. It's not popular in our tradition right now. I don't know if you've noticed, there's a few less people here than there were when I got here. John, as a leader of Crossroads, experienced the exact same pain from standing in a space of inclusion as a church. This church knows and has paid the price in some ways, but has also experienced the beauty of it. Do you know, this is Lindsay. No, this is not Lindsay. This is MJ. Lindsay was here. Lindsay was here earlier, right? They swapped on me. I had a bad peripheral vision today. This is MJ. Do you know when we centered our interpreters, people left? Because it was too distracting. You know why we centered the interpreters? Because we asked the deaf and hard of hearing community where they wanted the interpreter. And we thought that's maybe a good idea. Maybe a good idea that if you are deaf or hard of hearing, you should be able to sit wherever you want to, just like everybody else. But what happened? The collective identity of the dominant experience is challenged, it's new, it's different. So what we have to do is we have to continue to do this. We need women's voices on our stage teaching, queer voices teaching, offering wisdom in their experience, BIPOC voices, voices of people with disabilities. We need all of these things. And so Crossroads will not be silent, and Crossroads has never been silent. Will not be silent towards, and we will not make excuses for the dehumanizing, racist, sexist, homophobic rhetoric found in American politics and in American Christianity. We will not be silent. We will take up our cross and follow Jesus by loving our enemies, by praying for those who persecute us and abandon us. And we will return hatred with forgiveness, because that is the difficult, hard path of Jesus. And whatever the cost, no matter the cost, we have to keep fixated on that. The truth is, and you're going to hear about this, we're at a very pivotal moment in the life of our church, where our continued living into these values has put us in a space that says, we might not be in this building in 2 years from now. And I am so proud that we have a leadership that says, that would be a bummer, but that's not why we're here. We're here to offer the peacemaking path of Jesus to those that are marginalized, just like Jesus did. And that's the beauty of what this place has been for 25, 30 years. And we live in a cultural moment where it is even less popular than it was 20 years ago. And here's the thing. When we do this, when we center those voices, when we elevate those voices, true inclusion, the amplification of the marginalized voices that Jesus modeled, the way to do that, sets a table. Listen, it sets a table for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and they will be satisfied. Can I share with you, without tears, to hunger and thirst for righteousness is not a moral endeavor. To hunger and thirst for righteousness is not to say, I don't want to look at porn anymore. To hunger and thirst for righteousness is not to say, I don't want to cuss anymore. To hunger and thirst for, that's not what hunger, I'm not saying those things, that might not be something you want to cuss less and look at porn less. Okay, but that's not what hunger, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, the word righteousness means justice. And that fits the, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn. But what is the common denominator? Marginalization, pain that happens, the mourning of loss, the poverty that you experience. You hunger and thirst for someone, for some place to honor you as whole, regardless of your ability or disability, regardless of your documentation, regardless of what this world wants to differentiate and other. That is the person who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. And there are not enough tables being set in churches today. There's just not. But when we do it, we set the table. And there's a great feast. And when the table is set, the brokenhearted and the marginalized and the poor in spirit, here's what's going to happen. It's so selfish of us to do it. Because when we set that table, you know what happens? Those of us who are dead in our sin will be resurrected and our bones will no longer be dry. And our faith will come alive. And it will no longer be about me. It will no longer be about my privilege, but it will be about the people Jesus was about. And I'm transformed in that. That's how resurrection works. When I am in the presence of the crucified one, I am transformed. That's the beauty of this tradition. And in that moment, we understand hope is here because the marginalized are here. Because the brokenhearted are here. Because the poor are here. The grieving ones are here. And they are here replacing our heart of stone with a heart of flesh. That's inclusion. We're going to have communion together now. Our team has prepared a music video for you during communion. So if you're in seats anywhere, I want to invite you to stand to make it a little easier for folks as they might want to slip out. You don't have to have communion. Everybody's welcome, obviously, at communion. It's not obvious, I shouldn't say that. Here, everyone is welcome at the table. These are symbols of divine love and grace and mercy and hope. And they remind us that it's love and forgiveness that empowers and heals the world. And so it fuels us, it nourishes our bodies. And so while this video is playing, I want to invite you to come and receive communion. We're going to sing another song today together as we embrace this value that is so urgently needed. And as we embrace the suffering that will come with it, as we relieve suffering, and we will celebrate the healing that takes place through the ministry of our church, of our own lives and of the lives who are marginalized, and we will celebrate that regardless of the address. And we will celebrate that regardless of the day or the medium, because the mission is peacemaking. The mission and the vision is to create and encourage and equip and offer opportunities and invite people into this beautiful peacemaking path of Jesus that transforms us, transforms others. It makes the world a better, more inclusive place. The body of Christ broken for you, the blood of Christ shed for you. Would you stand with me, please? And check out this video as you have communion and consider inclusion.